in 1837, when on the foggy morning in November 1783, King George entered, which had been the ideal of English literature for more than 1,000 years, though it was not till 1832 when the Reform Bill became the law of the land that England herself by America and became the democracy of which writers had always dreamed. The half century between these two events is one of great turmoil, yet of steady advance in every department of English life. Unrest was the French Revolution, that frightful uprising which proclaimed the natural rights of man and the abolition of class distinctions. Its effect on the whole civilized world is beyond computation. Better in England, all asserting the doctrine of liberty, equality, fraternity, and the watchwords of the revolution. Young England, led by Pitt the Younger, hailed the new French Republic and offered it friendship. But her own looked with horror on the turmoil in France and, misled by Burke and the novels of the dialogue, forced the two nations into war. Even Pitt saw a blessing in this at first, because the sudden zeal for fighting foreign nations, which by some horrible perversion is generally called patriotism, might turn men's thoughts from their own to their neighbors' affairs, and so prevent a threatened revolution at home. The cause of this threatened revolution were not political but economic. By her inventions in steel and machinery, and by her monopoly of the carrying trade, England had become the workshop of the world. Her wealth and increase beyond her wildest dreams, but the unequal distribution of that wealth was a spectacle to make angels weep. The invention of machinery at first threw thousands of skilled hand workers out of employment. In order to protect a few agriculturists, heavy duties were imposed on corn and wheat, and bread rose to famine prices just when neighboring men had the least money to pay for it. There followed a curious spectacle. While England increased in wealth and spent vast sums to support her army and subsidize her allies in Europe, and while nobles, landowners, manufacturers, and merchants lived in it, increasing luxury, a multitude of skilled laborers were clamoring for work. Fathers sent their wives and little children into the mines and factories, where 16 hours labor would hardly pay for the daily bread. And in every large city were riotous mobs, made up chiefly of hungry men and women. It was this unbearable economic condition, and not any political theory, as Burke supposed, which occasioned the danger of another English revolution. It is only when we remember these conditions that we can understand two books, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, which can hardly be considered as literature, but which exercised an enormous influence in England. Smith was a Scottish thinker who wrote to uphold the doctrine that labor is the only source of a nation's wealth and that any attempt to force labor into unnatural channels or to prevent it by protective duties from freely obtaining the raw materials for its industry is unjust and destructive. Penn was a curious combination of Jekyll and Hyde, shallow and untrustworthy personally, but with a passionate devotion to popular liberty. His Rights of Man, published in London in 1791, was like one of outcries against institutions which oppressed humanity, coming so soon, it added fuel to the flames kindled in England by the French Revolution. The author was driven out of the country on the curious ground that he endangered the English Constitution, but not until his book had gained a wide sale and influence. All these dangers, real and imaginary, passed by when England turned from the affairs of France to remedy her own economic conditions. The long continental war came to an end with Napoleon overthrow at Waterloo in 1850, and England, having gained enormously in prestige abroad, now turned to the work of reform at home. The destruction of the African slave trade, the mitigation of horribly unjust laws, which included poor debtors and petty criminals in the same class, the prevention of child labor, the freedom of the press, the extension of the manhood suffrage, the abolition of the restrictions against Catholics in Parliament, the establishment of the hundreds of popular schools under the leadership of Andrew Bell and Joseph Lancaster. These are but a few of the reforms which mark the progress of civilization in a single half century. When England in 1833 proclaimed the emancipation of all slaves in all her colonies, she unconsciously proclaimed her final emancipation from barbarism. Literary characteristics of the age. It is immensely interesting to note how literature at first reflected the political turmoil of the age, and then, when the turmoil was over and England began her mighty work of reform, now literature suddenly developed a new creative spirit, which shows itself in the poetry of Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Keats, and in prose of Scott, Jane Austen, Lamb, and De Quincey, a wonderful group of writers whose patriotic enthusiasm suggests the Elizabethan days and whose genius has caused their age to be known as the second creative period of our literature. Thus, in the early days, when old institutions seemed crumbling with the Bastille, Coleridge and Shaw they formed their truthful scheme of a patriocy on the banks of the Susquehanna, an ideal commonwealth in which the principles of Maud's utopia should be put in practice. Even Wordsworth, fired with political enthusiasm, could write. Rich was it in that dawn to be alive, But to be young was really heaven. The essence of Romanticism was, it must be remembered that the literature must reflect all that is spontaneous and unaffected in nature and in man, and be free to follow its own fancy in its own way. We have already noted this characteristic in the work of the Elizabethan dramatists who followed their own genius in opposition to all the laws of the critics. In Coleridge, we see this independence expressed in Kubla Khan and the Ancient Mariner, two dreams pictures, one of the populous Orient, the other of the lonely sea. In Wordsworth, this literary independence led him inward to the heart of the common text, following his own instinct as Shakespeare does. He too finds tongues in trees, books in the running books, sermons in stones, and good in everything. And so, more than any other writer of the age, he invests the common life of nature and the souls of common men and women with glorious significance. These two poets, Coleridge and Wordsworth, best represent the romantic genius of the age in which they lived. Those quote had a greater literary reputation, and Byron and Shelley had larger audiences. The second characteristic of this age is that it is emphatically an age of poetry. The previous century, with its practical outlook on life, was largely one of prose, but now, as in the Elizabethan age, the young enthusiasts turned as naturally to poetry as a happy man to singing. The glory of the age is in the poetry of Scott, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Keats, Moore, and Southey, of which prose works, those of Scott alone, have attained a very wide reading, though the essays of the Charles Lamb and the novels of Jane Austen have slowly won for their authors a secure place in the history of our literature. Coleridge and Southey, with Wordsworth formed the trio of so-called leg poets, wrote for far more prose than poetry, and Southey's prose is much better than his verse. It was characteristic of the spirit of the chase, so different from our own that Southey could say that in order to earn money, he wrote in verse what would otherwise have been better written in prose. It was during this period that women assumed for the first time an important place in our literature. Probably the chief reason for this interesting phenomenon lies in the fact that women was for the first time given some slight chance of education, of entering into the intellectual life of the race. And as is always the case when woman is given anything like a fair opportunity, she responded magnificently. A secondary reason may be found in the nature of the age itself, which was intentionally emotional. The French Revolution stirred all Europe to its depths, and during the following half century, every great moment in literature, as in politics and religion, was characterized by strong emotion, which is all the more noticeable by contrast with the cold, formal, satiric spirit of the early 18th century. As women is naturally more emotional than men, it may well be that the spirit of this emotional age attracted her and gave her the opportunity to express herself in literature. As all strong emotions tend to extremes, the age produced a new type of novel which seems rather hysterical now, but which in its own day delighted multitudes of readers whose nerves were somewhat excited and who reveled in bogey stories of supernatural terror. Mrs. Anne Radcliffe, 1764 to 1823, was one of the most successful writers of this school of exaggerated romance. Her novels, with their azure-eyed heroines, haunted castles, trapdoors, bandits, abductions, rescues in the nick of time, and a general medley of outrot joys and sorrows were immensely popular, not only with crowds of novel readers, but also with men of unquestioned literary genius like Scott and Byron. In marked contrast to these extravagant stories is the enduring work of Jane Austen with her charming descriptions of everyday life, and of Maria Edgeworth, whose wonderful pictures of Irish life suggested to Walter Scott the idea of writing his Scottish romances. Two other women who attained a more or less lasting fame were Hannah More, poet, dramatist, and novelist, and Jane Porter, whose Scottish chiefs and Thaddeus of Warsaw. Thaddeus, Thaddeus of Warsaw are still in demand in our libraries. Beside these were Fanny Burney, Madame D. Arbelay, and several other writers whose works in the early part of the 19th century raised women to the high place in literature, which she has ever since maintained. In this age, literary criticism became firmly established by the appearance of such magazines as the Edinburgh Review, 1802, the Quarterly Review, 1808, Blackwood's Magazine, 1817, the Westminster Review, 1824, the Spectator, 1828, the Athenaeum, 1828, and Fraser's Magazine, 1830. These magazines, edited by such men as Francis Jeffrey, John Wilson, who is known as to us as Christopher North, and John Gibson Lockhart, who gave us the life of Scott, exercised an immense influence on all subsequent literature. At first, their criticisms were largely destructive, as when Jeffrey hammered Scott, Wordsworth, and Byron most unmercifully, and Lockhart could find no good in either Keats or Tennyson. But with added wisdom, criticism assumed its true function of construction, and when these magazines began to seek and to publish the works of unknown writers like Hazlitt, Lamb, and Leigh-Hunt, they discovered the chief mission of the modern magazine, which is to give every writer of ability the opportunity to make his work known to the world. The poet of Romanticism, William Wordsworth, 1770 to 1850. It was in 1797 that the new romantic movement in our literature assumed definite form. Wordsworth and colleagues retired to the Quintock Hills, Somerset, and there formed the deliberate purpose to make literature adapted to interest mankind permanently, which they declared classic poetry could never do. Helping the two poets was Wordsworth's sister Dorothy, with a woman's love for flowers and all beautiful things, and a woman's divine sympathy for human life, even in its loveliest forms. Though a silent partner, she furnished perhaps the largest share of the inspiration which resulted in the famous lyrical ballads of 1798. In their partnership, Coleridge was to take up the supernatural or at least romantic, while Wordsworth was to give of novelty to things of everyday by awakening the mind's attention from the lethargy of custom and directing it to the loveliness and the wonders of the world before us. The whole spirit of their work is reflected in two poems of this remarkable little volume, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is Coleridge's masterpiece, and lines written a few miles above Tilton Abbey, which expresses Wordsworth's poetical creed and which is one of the noblest and most significant of our poems, that the lyrical ballads attracted no attention and was practically ignored by a public that would soon go into raptures over Byron's Child Harold and Don Juan is of small consequence. Many men will hurry a mile to see skyrockets who never notice Orion and the Pleiades from their own doorstep. Had Wordsworth and Coleridge written only this one little book, they could still be among the representative writers of an age that proclaimed the final triumph of Romanticism